Thank you so much. So yeah, helped to organize the grassroots campaign Shaq USA. So this kind of Q&A is all about the film The Animal People, which hopefully many of you have seen. Yeah, give a wave if you have. And that's all about kind of Shaq USA and the work that they did and do. So dubbed the Shaq 7, Jake and his co-defendants were found guilty and were sentenced to 4 years in federal prison after being arrested by the US government for his role in this campaign. Currently, Jake works at the Rainforest Action Network, which is an international organization which uses pressure campaigns to stop rainforest deforestation, fossil fuel extraction, and support human rights. And he's also known as the Cranky vegan online. So yeah, if you haven't already found him on YouTube and all the channels, he's talks about strategies and tactics and optics of the grassroots animal rights movement. So thank you so much for coming and joining us here tonight. Yeah, how you doing, Jake? Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate setting it up and having everyone come on board, and hopefully we'll have a good discussion.
Definitely. So basically the format of tonight will be that Angela's going to start with some, just some chill icebreaker questions. And then I'm going to ask 2 or 3 questions just to kind of get the ball rolling. And then the most of tonight will be dedicated to audience Q&A. So we've allowed for like an hour and a half, but we'll just see how we go. And yeah, we'll see. So yeah, we'll wrap things up definitely by 8:30, but yeah, we'll see how things go. So yeah, I'll throw to Angela to get us started with some icebreaker questions.
Thank you, Holly.
I'm terrible at icebreaker questions, just as a heads up. That should be the first question. Are you good at icebreaker questions? No. Second question.
That broke the ice, I guess.
Yeah. Hopefully it should be okay, because it's just, there's only 2 options. So we're going to play this or that. So first one, TV or film?
See, this is why I'm bad, because there's so much nuance to all these answers. But I'll go with film.
Cool. Horror or comedy?
Comedy.
Beach or forest?
I like when they meet.
Oh, no. People are like, yeah. Winter or summer?
Yeah, I guess summer. If it's not too muggy.
Sweet or savory?
For the last 43 years of my life, I would say sweet, but I'm slowly coming on board with the savory.
Early rise or late nights?
Late nights, unfortunately.
Video games or board games?
I hate to say it, but video games.
Non-fiction or fiction books?
Currently fiction.
Cool. So that was fun, but I've got one last question. Since a few people here might know that you're a fan of the Protego Foundation, so I have to ask, which Harry Potter house, which Hogwarts house are you in?
I refuse to be sorted unless it's been done by the actual hat.
That's a great
I'm not letting a computer pick my house.
Can you tell us
that you would trust a talking hat over a computer?
Absolutely.
Who
wouldn't?
True. Cool. Well, I think we've gotten all we needed to get out of tonight. So yeah, feel free to leave now.
All right. Good night.
No, please stay. So I am going to be asking some more serious, maybe more insightful questions. We'll see. Or we can just keep going with
this or
ice cream
that.
and chocolate. Yeah. But I just wanted to say I loved Angela's look of disappointment and disdain when you chose comedy over horror.
I mean, I like both.
Comedy, horror?
Cabin in the Woods, great combination of comedy and horror.
There you go. Yes. Amazing. So I'm gonna kick us off with some questions. And yeah, while I'm talking, feel free to start writing down your questions that you want to ask, because yeah, we'll have plenty of time. We want to get to as many questions as possible. So have them prepped to either pop in the chat after we're done, after I'm done talking, or say out loud. So the first question I want to ask you is, you talk a lot about your time in prison. and that being kind of a direct result of state repression. So as you may know, I think you do know, I've watched your latest video, this current situation in the UK is that, you know, there's these new anti-protest laws kind of being pushed through, and it's been quite, yeah, it's been intense for a lot of activists working on a lot of different movements across the UK. With all of this going on, I'm really curious to know if you would have any advice on managing repression when we're doing our activism.
Managing it on like a personal level or on like organizational level, or both?
Yeah, I think well, both, but I guess like on a tactical and strategic level, like when we're thinking about doing actions and kind of facing police and increased like policing laws.
Yeah, I think that something I really love about grassroots organizing is that it's very creative, and I think, you know, these bills and these laws and the ways that the government and corporations try to stop us from doing what we're doing can feel very overwhelming, and they are at times, can be scary and frightening. But I also think we are a creative bunch and we can figure out ways around it. Organizing around it, loopholes in the law, all sorts of different things, challenging it legally speaking or otherwise. I think we have creative ways of doing it. I think as activists, when we're organizing, I think there's a variety of different things we can do to combat state repression. I think security culture is super important. I think we live in a world right now where social media kind of rules everything, and we have a tendency, all of us, myself included, to want to post things and share things and put photos and videos and this, that, and the other thing up on the internet and on social media. But it's such an easy access for anyone to pay attention to what you're doing and when you're doing it and how you're doing it. And sometimes there's benefits to that, and sometimes there are negative sides to that. In Shaq, we took our security super seriously, and it turns out that we had a good reason to. And what we did worked. I mean, the government has said that they had a tougher time cracking the animal rights movement than they did cracking the mafia. And that's because the animal rights movement has historically, at least, you know, in my time, has been very security conscious. When we did Shaq, I mean, we went really overboard, like not overboard, but it was a lot. Like it was an enormous amount of work to keep ourselves as secure as possible. And it didn't always work, but in a lot of ways it did work. I think there's a point where like it starts to become problematic, and that you're spending more time worrying about security than doing your actual activism. And I think that can become a hindrance. So I think that's something to be conscious of. So I think there is like finding that balance between like how much is, you know, protecting your organization and your movement important to you, balanced with like when does it become problematic. And so I think those are like discussions worth having. But I think there are lots of things you can do from like a security standpoint, like to protect yourself as an organization. It's not always going to work because you're going against some of the most powerful people and entities in the world. On an individual level, I think it's important to recognize like what you're comfortable with as an individual and as an activist, and what you can and can't do or don't feel comfortable doing, and being true to that, and not feeling like you have to do something you don't want to do. I think there's a lot of privilege in protest, and there's a lot of privilege in being arrested. You know, as like a het cis white man, like me, getting arrested is a completely different experience than a person of color or a trans person or a gay person. Like my experiences with the police, my experiences with how I'm treated, my experiences in jail or in prison are going to be a lot different than others. So I think recognizing that internally, but also having those conversations with your organization is super important. And I also think, you know, we in the animal rights movement look at being arrested as like a badge of honor, like, oh, if you're not being arrested, you're not doing it right. But as I said, there's privilege in that, but there's also a lack of communication around what arrested really means. And that's going to be different for every person in every city, in every country. But having real conversations with people and being like, this is what could happen, might not be what will happen, but these are the potential outcomes, so that people are aware of what could be the outcome, so that they can be better informed on what they're doing. We have an organization in the United States called the National Lawyers Guild, which are activist attorneys around the country, and you can call them up and be like, hey, we're gonna do a civil disobedience, or we're gonna do a sit-in. Like, can you tell us what potentially the outcomes are, legally speaking, of us doing it? And they will happily provide you with that information for free. And maybe you have something like that where you live as well. But I think it's important to know what you're getting into before you put yourself in those situations. And as organizers, it's your responsibility to make sure the people that you're organizing are aware of it too. I'm not sure that really answers the question.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Okay. I also
yeah.
tend to ramble, so just cut me off when I'm talking too much.
Yeah, that's probably not going to happen, because I find it fascinating. But yeah, I will keep that in mind. Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting topic, because obviously it's something that we'll face, like, as individuals and as organizers. And yeah, kind of spreading that knowledge is so important. And I see a question from Ben in the chat about some examples of security culture in Shaq, which I'm going to throw to in a minute. But I'll just quickly ask the other question I had before opening to the audience, which is, so Animal Rebellion, we use, like, mass nonviolent civil disobedience is our tactic, and we focus on actions that are more disruptive and, like, higher impact. When we're, like, watching the Animal People, you know, it showed a real variety of disruptive tactics that obviously have some controversy attached to them, some more controversial than others. And I wanted to hear kind of your perspective on, you know, criticisms that say that this form of activism, you know, turns people off, or that it's counterintuitive to the cause or something, because it's making people, you know, just annoyed and irritated. So yeah, I just wanted to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, well, I think there's, like, a broader conversation that we've all probably had, in that, you know, we have to disrupt, and we have to irritate, and we have to push back in order to make large social change. So it's just the way it's going to work. You're always going to irritate someone. I mean, in the United States, people get irritated that people get down their knee before a sporting event, and that is some sort of, you know, it's, you know, everything's going to irritate someone at some point. So for me, in regards to Shaq and the controversial tactics we used, I think it speaks to a conversation to be had when organizing, in that, are you organizing a short-term campaign, or you're organizing a long-term campaign? And so Shaq had a history prior to trying to shut down the laboratory, which isn't featured in the Animal People, but, you know, the same people that organized Shaq shut down Consort Beagle Breeder, Hillgrove Cat Farm, Regal Rabbit Farm, Shamrock Primate Farm. They're shutting these places down one after another, and they were doing it quickly, generally within a year. And so those were organized as short-term pressure campaigns. And Shaq was also organized as a short-term pressure campaign. And what I mean by that is that, in part, the strategy was you hit them as hard as you can, as fast as you can, regardless of how you may be perceived in the general public or by the authorities. But if you can hit them fast enough and win before the response, or before the you know, the authorities catch up with you, or you're arrested, or for whatever, you know, whatever, then it's worth it, right? If you can shut down these places before you're held accountable for your actions, and you still win. And if people get arrested for it, so be it. Long-term strategy, and so with a short-term strategy, I would say that you worry less about public perception. You don't care, because you don't need the general public to win. I think long-term strategizing, you do have to take into account public perception, and what the public thinks of you, because in a sense, they become judge and jury. And if you want to build your movement, have it become stronger and bigger, and, you know, you in theory will need more people to do that. And so those things, I think, are something to think about when you're starting out. You know, with Shaq, I think it was a great example of, it started out as a short-term strategy, meaning we didn't care what people thought about us. And in fact, the fact that people hated us and thought we were awful worked to our advantage. We could go to a company and be like, hey, well, this is who we are. This is why we are opposed to what you're doing. Would you consider stop doing it? In the beginning of our campaign, people would be like, who the hell are you? Like, you're a bunch of kids. Like, we don't care what you have to say. And they would go on about their business. But 2-3 years into the campaign, and they're like, oh, Shaq, what is this? And they look it up and they're like, oh shit, like, this is not what we want to have happen to our company. We're just going to pull out of this contract right now. And so it helped. But as the campaign went on, it became much harder to organize and build that support when we needed it, particularly like when you get put on trial. That it should have shifted from a short-term to a long-term strategy, and it didn't. And that ended up really biting us because Shaq eventually fell apart. So I think, those are things that need to be thought about beforehand or during, and are reevaluated as your campaign goes on. I think with Extinction Rebellion and Animal Rebellion, from what little I know, I think people respond differently to mass civil disobedience. I think there's a piece of a general public that isn't involved in activism that might look at that and be like, wow, that's impressive. Like look at that. Like you get their attention. And if that's what your goal is, then you've succeeded. And of course, you're going to get naysayers that are going to be like, you're clogging up traffic and I can't get to work. And you're like, I don't really care. So I think you have to find that balance, right? That's going to work. In the United States, with these big mass mobilizations, often we have people that will direct traffic if ambulances come or fire trucks come, and like preparing for situations like that seems like a smart tactic.
Definitely, yeah. And if you ever want to get trained up in stewarding or de-escalation or police liaison, keep an eye out. Sorry, had to give a plug. Cool. Thank you so much. Really great answers and really interesting conversation. So yeah, I want to open it up to the audience now. So I'll be keeping an eye out in hands, and Angela will be keeping an eye out in the chat. So you can do either way. But Angela, did you want to start with? I think there's a couple of questions in the chat already.
Yes, so we have one from Ben saying, what are some examples of your security culture in Shaq?
Yeah, some of them were extraordinary. Some of them were exhausting. Some of them I think were common sense. When I first got involved in activism, that like security culture was a big thing. Like you immediately are told like, you don't say anything or write anything, or, as internet became more available, you don't send an email that you wouldn't want to show to the police. Sending an email is the equivalent of sending a postcard in the mail. Anyone can read it. I think that's a good way to think about email. So to that end, we used encryption. We used PGP, which I think it may still be around. I'm not up on security technology anymore, unfortunately, but we used PGP, which the government could not crack. It was kind of, PGP was big in the animal rights movement, which is an encryption software that encrypts email correspondence. You can also encrypt files and encrypt partitions on your computer. And there was always a question of like, does it really work? Because it hadn't really been tried. And with our case, they could not crack PGP. I mean, they said in court that they could have, multiple supercomputers trying to crack the algorithm for years, and they would never crack it. So I think there is something to be said to using a smart and appropriate encryption. They just turned to the argument in our case that, well, if you're encrypting something, it means you're hiding something, and the only people that hide things are people that do things illegal. So that was their argument, and it worked. But I think it's kind of a long shot. We would, there was a lot of things done through mail then, right? Because we got a lot of donations and letters and things like that. So we burnt everything. We never shredded or threw anything away. Everything got burnt in a bucket or a fireplace every day. We would never talk indoors, not necessarily because we were doing anything illegal, but we might be organizing like the next month of our campaign, or we're organizing a demonstration, or something we wouldn't want anyone else to hear about. And again, not because it was illegal, just because we knew everyone was listening. So we might get in the car and drive to the woods and go walk in the woods. I mean, things that were like pretty intense, and the government tried to hack into our computers. We were the first group of people in the United States that the government tried to hack into, use malware to get into our systems, to put key sniffers on to try to figure out what the passwords were to our encryption. So we would do things like typing your passwords in like on, like a text edit document and copying and pasting and then clearing the cache. It was exhausting. It was it was an awful, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, it was intense. And we had a laptop that we made sure never was online. Like literally we would buy it and never put it online. So there was no way anyone could put anything on that computer in terms of malware. That computer remained offline for its entire life, never touched the internet. That way you could write and talk about and store sensitive documents on there. Just things like that. Like in a way it was kind of fun and interesting, trying to figure out how to get around the government and private investigators. And going through trial was really interesting because you find out that it actually works. Like a lot of these things actually worked. But it's an exhausting life. I mean, I would not recommend it for anyone. But so just being careful and being smart at the end of the day, right? Don't write anything or say anything that you wouldn't want everyone else to hear, unless you do it encrypted or you do it face to face. I think is a good way.
Cool, thank you. So I'm gonna take hands. So if anyone wants to ask a question, like with their voice, please put your hand up. Rowan, you're the first person I saw.
Yeah, thanks, Harley, and yeah, thank you, Jake. So during these very turbulent times, I thought it would be a good idea to ask you, when you feel unfocused or overwhelmed with everything going on and so many details at once and everything, what do you do to center yourself or gain clarity and focus and temperance again?
Yeah, I'm terrible at it. But I do think like self-care is super important. And I think a few things that I've done to kind of center myself and take a step back at times and make sure that I'm taken care of is finding a hobby that has nothing to do with activism, but also a hobby that maybe can help your activism. That was really important. When I got out of prison, I was on probation for 3 years, so I couldn't engage in the kind of activism I'd been doing for the 10 years prior. And so I was kind of forced into this position where I had to figure out other ways to not just be active, but other ways to just like exist as a human being after doing activism for like 100% of my time. So yeah, so like finding a hobby was really important, finding things that I enjoyed doing that felt relaxing. I think, it's often frowned upon to take time for yourself in the activist movement, but take it. I don't care if it's 10 minutes, 10 hours, 10 days, 10 weeks. Like if you need the break, just do it. I do things that I find calming. I like to walk in the woods. I like to camp. I like to hike. I like to watch both TV and film, horror and comedy. So I do those things and don't feel too bad about it. I think other things that I've done that have helped me kind of be centered, but also maintain my activism was being involved in other movements. And what I got out of that was it allowed me to participate or be involved in activism as a participant rather than as an organizer. And that took a lot of pressure off of like, you need to be organizing, you're responsible, you need to be doing this, this, and this. There wasn't a list of things I needed to do in order to participate or help. It was just, I could just show up. And that was in a way kind of comforting because it allowed me to take a step back, but also still be active. And the beautiful things that came out of being involved in other movements was making really great friends, seeing that people outside of the animal rights movement who aren't vegan do amazing activism, including meat-eating environmentalists, despite our anger around the issue. Finding people that are doing really more important activism. They're organizing strategically in really smart ways and in ways that we often don't think about in the animal rights movement. And so learning from them, learning their strategies and their tactics, becoming friends with them and building those bridges was really important. And that kind of final step of that, which I guess I kind of do now, is taking a lot of the things that I've learned there and bringing them back to the animal rights movement in hopes that we can learn from them as well. So building those bridges in very kind of gentle ways was really helpful for me.
Okay, awesome. So gonna move to one from the chat. This is from Tom. They say, when are you going to write the book on animal rights, pressure campaigns, strategies, and tactics?
Oh, that never. Next. I think I'm writing a book on my time in prison because I think it's an interesting story. And I think it's something that's talked about far less than animal rights activism. Perhaps maybe I'm wrong. But that's the story I think I'll tell next.
On that, actually, like some of you might know, but we have actually 2 people from Animal Rebellion who are in prison right now. So just when you said that, just like if anyone wants to write to them, please like send me a letter, but send me a message. Don't send me a letter. Won't get to me. Send me a message. Because yeah, just like when you said that, yeah, I think it's so important that we know more about what that's like, and also showing support for people who are in that situation. So yeah, just let me know. I will pass to Ben, who had his hand up before, to ask a question.
Hey, Jake. Yeah, I really hear you on the meat-eating environmentalists, obviously, because we're great friends with XR. But my question, kind of linked to that, is we have almost co-opted is what we tried to do in the environmental movement and get them talking about animal ag, but we've always failed, I feel, to find the animal people. And my question is, where is the animal rights movement? And like, where are they? Has it been broken? Because with all of our actions, there just doesn't seem to be one anymore. And when we're trying to, and I'd like to know where is it? Because Shaq obviously found them, and it'd be great if we could do the same.
Yeah, I think the magic of pressure campaigns is that you give the impression that there's loads of people working on them when really there's just a handful. I think that's probably the case in any movement, really. I think when we've seen campaigns work in big ways in the grassroots animal rights movement, it's predominantly a handful of people that are putting in all the work and doing all the work because they can, and they want to, and they're able to. And then there's a whole bunch of people that participate when they can, and in a lesser extent, which is totally fine. Obviously, like, everyone has different abilities and opportunities. I think the other thing why those campaigns worked is because they lowered that moral baseline that we really revere in the animal rights movement. This idea, as I said, like, you can't be a meat-eating environmentalist, or you can't love animals and eat them too. I mean, you can be a meat-eating environmentalist and you can love animals and eat them too. It's weird, like, ethically, sure, but it happens all the time. I mean, in the United States, there's far more people that care about animals that are vegan. That's true. I mean, there are people that in the United States that aren't vegan that are stopping factory farms, that are slowing down animal agriculture. There are people that are like, helping animals in really big ways, probably more than vegans and animal rights people are. But because they're not vegan, they don't count in the animal rights movement. And I think it's like one of the biggest things we really need to get over ourselves. That, like, making someone being vegan doesn't make you better than everyone else. I think that, like, if we can tap into that energy, right, and that excitement to help animals and allow people to fight for animals and bypass that moral baseline, fight for animals before they're vegan, then I think our movement really can start to grow. And I think that's the great thing about pressure campaigning, is that you can have those conversations later down the road about, like, hey, we're fighting for, in the case of Shaq, we're fighting for this dog and the cat, but also the dog and the cat in the cage is the same as the chicken and the pig and the cow. And I think, those conversations come and people start putting those connections together. I think we do a lot more for bettering the world through pressure campaigns than we do by just simply making vegans. And I think, as you probably have seen, perhaps in, partnering between Animal and Extinction Rebellion, that you can find those commonalities of, like, hey, factory farming's messed up, animal agriculture's messed up. Cool, well, let's work together to combat that. And then, you know, those conversations come later. It's like, also, you know, like the animals on the farm are, you know, sentient creatures and enduring an enormous amount of pain, and they shouldn't be used in that way or anyway, you know. So I think building those original bridges of commonality are much more important than pointing fingers at people and saying you're not being the exact person that I want you to be. And ultimately, I think that's what leads to the animal rights movement constantly being smaller and smaller and smaller. And that's unfortunate.
So could I just, so do you think it is smaller because is it not what it once was now than what it was in like 2004? That was sort of almost the core of the question.
Yeah, I mean, how do we measure those things? I'm not really sure. I think that's a bigger discussion, but like my heart is in the grassroots animal rights movement, and that's what I look at in terms of like what my community is. Yeah, there are loads of people that are involved in national organizations. There are loads of people that are plant-based. There are more plant-based people eating plant-based probably than ever before, but I would still maintain that's a tiny percent of the population and not where it needs to be in order to ever make a difference. But I think in terms of grassroots animal rights activism, it's really kind of been co-opted by this idea of like, oh, if we could just get enough people to become plant-based, then the world will change. I disagree with that theory of change. But I think I'm not sure I would include that kind of framework in grassroots animal rights movement. Not because it's necessarily bad. Like I want people to be plant-based, I want people to be vegan, but I don't think that's what the grassroots animal rights movement is about, is educational outreach as a standalone strategy. And so to that end, I would say that the grassroots animal rights movement is small. And perhaps smaller. I think after the Shaq campaign, and I don't like to admit it, but I think the government won in that they crushed the grassroots animal rights movement. People got scared. They didn't want to be thrown into jail. They didn't want to be called terrorists, and I don't blame any of them. Like I have no shame in like those people, or no, you know, for being nervous and doing something different. I totally get it. But I do think that like, you know, that need and desire for campaigning is starting to come back around again. So, but yeah, I mean, you know, we see a lot of like, there was 10,000 people at this march, and that's the biggest march ever for animals, which is great. That's amazing, 10,000 people, but it's not the biggest march for animals. I mean, 1990 March for Animals in Washington, D.C., there were 60 to 70,000 people. Like, where do those people go? You know, if we can get 70,000 people to an animal march in Washington, D.C., where are those 70,000 people now? And so by measurements like that, I would argue we are not the fastest growing social justice movement, which is something we hear a lot, or we are not, you know, increasing our numbers. We might be increasing people that eat plant-based diets, but we're not increasing vegan animal rights activists that are out in the streets fighting for animals, in my opinion. I could be wrong.
Great. So I got a question from Joe in the chat. Were you prepared to be arrested and given jail time when it happened?
Yes and no. I think like this is a different time. I think in the 90s when I first got involved, it was like the cops are out to get you all the time. You're going to go to jail. There's no question about it. Just do what you got to do. And then like eventually, you know, when that day comes, deal with it. Was kind of like the general feeling back at the time. So, you know, I think so to that extent, like I thought about it and thought, oh, well, someday I'm sure I'll be arrested and not, you know, and go to jail in some regards. I think with Shaq, I think we knew that we were being watched, and I think we knew that we were being investigated in pretty big ways. And then our home was raided, which you saw as like the first scene in the Animal People. And so that's when you start realizing, well, the government raids your homes because they're building a case against you. And so I think there was that point where it was like, okay, well, you know, it's becoming more and more serious. But I think one of the downfalls of Shaq, one of the problems with Shaq was that there was a lot of like bravado and machismo and like chest pounding that, you know, we can't be stopped. And, you know, it was kind of like detrimental for a variety of reasons. And I think one of those was that we thought we couldn't be stopped. You know, something that's out in the movie is that we were sued 24 different times by 24 different corporations. We had I think it was a $12 million federal RICO civil suit brought against us as individuals, and we've managed to like beat them all or get around them all creatively, and it just felt like you couldn't be stopped. I think for me, like when we eventually got closer to trial, then for me personally, I was like, okay, this is not going to end well for us, and so I just kind of started making plans in other ways, mentally and physically, with friends and family and stuff, and just getting to terms with the fact that this isn't going to end well. So yeah, I don't think people should live their lives in fear of arrest or imprisonment. It's awful, but I think it's something that you can think about and be aware of. But I don't think it should frighten you away from doing activism. But as I said earlier, like you should also be very aware of what the realities are, and adjusting your activism in life accordingly is not something you should be ashamed of.
Thank you so much. Yeah, back to hands. So yeah, put your hand up if you have a question. Yeah, Fran. I'm not going to you again, Ben.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, in the movie, you mobilized a hell of a lot of people. Do you have any tips of how to sort of get people involved, get more people to join?
You just pay everyone. I'm just kidding. We're all paid protesters. I think there's a variety of ways. I think I always, when it comes to organizing, I think of Bobby Seale, who was the co-founder of the Black Panther Party for self-defense, and he said, in order to have a successful movement, you have to capture the imagination of the people. And I fully agree with that. I think if you want people to join you, you have to present them or give them something to join that is interesting, that's creative, that's smart, and that is winning, right? No one wants to be part of a losing team. Everyone wants to win. I think we have such high turnover in the animal rights movement is because we constantly lose, or we constantly feel like we're losing. And particularly when we focus so heavily on vegan outreach and put success indicators on how many people did you make go vegan, you'll lose that every time, because we're always going to be outnumbered. We're always going to be in the negative, and the animals being killed every year continues to rise. So I think people are like, what am I doing? I've spent the last 5 years talking to people, and things have only gotten worse. So I think people give up or leave or change because no one likes to lose. So I think if we give people fun things to do, smart things to do, creative things to do, and things that win, they will be a part of it. I talk about the breeder campaigns in the UK, starting out with that consort campaign. It was a small farm, and they took a year and they shut it down. And it slowly grew. And over that year, and when they won, they got 200 dogs out, and all of a sudden people were like holding the dogs and be like, this is what we were fighting for. Like, holy shit, like we can win. And they're like, what's next? Everyone wanted to know what's next. And they went to Hillgrove Cat Farm, shut that place down in 18 months. They got 800 cats. They went to Regal Rabbits, shut down Regal Rabbits in 7 days, and got 1,200 rabbits. Like, people were pumped up. And so then that's when, the original organizers were like, okay, now we can move on to something bigger, like HLS, the third largest laboratory of its kind in the world. And I think, again, that's also part of the problem with the animal rights movement, is that we want to go after the biggest players and we want to win immediately. And that's unfortunately just not how it's going to be. It's like if we all organized a football team and got together every Sunday and then complained about why we hadn't won the World Cup yet. It's like, well, because we're a little, rinky-dink football team. Like, we have to practice, you have to build up your skills, you have to get people on board. And it's the same thing with our activism. Like, we have to hone our skills, we have to practice, we have to get better before we can really take on these massive fights. And as I said, by doing so, people get attracted to it. I think the other piece that I've already spoken about is doing away with those moral baselines. I think you see the movements that are big and successful because they allow people to fight against these targets, regardless not regardless, but for a certain degree, regardless of what their political backgrounds are. Obviously, we don't want to have, you know, right-wing fascists and nationalists and things like that on board, but like recognizing that people that are fighting for justice and liberation are fighting for justice and liberation because they believe in it. And like our roads might not intersect right now, and they might not even in our lifetime, but eventually these roads will intersect. And so if we're all fighting for liberation, then let's fight for liberation together.
Thank you. That's really good. Yeah. I sort of, when we're marching with XR and stuff like that, sometimes there are people who are too scared like to be near our banner because they're like, oh, I don't want to stand over there because I'd be a hypocrite. And it's kind of like, no, please come and join us. You know, we you know, we recognize that it's not about just individual change. Yeah.
I think yeah, and what Fran says, like we kind of get the double whammy sometimes because we're very explicitly system change, and like we explicitly don't use like vegan outreach and all that kind of thing. So we kind of get the double whammy of environmentalists kind of being a bit like, oh, I don't want to stand with them, and then the vegans not wanting to stand with us either. So yeah, but yeah, really good ideas. And yeah, thanks for the question, Fran.
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, again, I'm not like huge, I don't know loads about extinction and animal rebellions, but from an outsider perspective, it feels like you're doing it right. You're like making those inroads into other movements. You're recognizing that these fights are intertwined, and you're doing the work to make sure that those other movements understand it in a way that isn't like you forcing it down their throats, but saying like, hey, we're here too, we support you, and hopefully at some point you'll support us. And I think it's a smart way to go. I think you can look at successful movements in the past that have done it that way and have succeeded.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else just get really excited when you're like, I think you're doing it right? So a question from Rowan saying, why do you still look like you're 25? Winky face.
Because I am 25, and I'm also using the Zoom 25-year-old filter, so it works out.
It's just fake news. You haven't actually done anything in the past.
No, I'm vegan. What other answers do you want from me?
I reckon
But
we
I
need
appreciate
another
it.
question
Thank
from the chat.
Another question from the chat we have, I hope I've not missed anyone. Is it Eilish?
Close enough, Eilish.
Eilish, oh sorry. So how have you managed the mental health impact of your activism, both at the time and now, particularly when faced with the might of the state? Like, how do you get any sleep when you were doing such extreme security measures?
Yeah, I didn't. That was the hard part. You know, we worked 7 days a week, 15 to 18 hours a day for 5.5 years. And before that, you know, I was doing activism that, you know, doing like Hunseb stuff where we were constantly being watched. Like, I know from documents that, you know, I got started in like mid to late 1995, I think, with my activism. And I know that I was being watched or surveyed by either the government or a private entity like a security company from 1997 until 2013 in different ways. So that wears down on you for sure. It's exhausting. It can be scary. It can cause anxiety. For me, I didn't really take any of that super seriously until after I got out of prison. Or actually the last year I was in prison, the last year or so that I was in prison, I really started like working on it. But for me, when I got out of prison, combined with the prisons I was in, they were pretty rough, or one of them was pretty rough. And then just Shaq, you know, I realized I really needed like help. And so I you know, started going to therapy, which I didn't really have any money for because I'd been in prison for years. And before that hadn't worked a job in 7 years or whatever it was. And so, you know, finding like a low income opportunity to go see a therapist was super helpful. She was super nice. It was like a school. So it was like, you know, she was learning and training, and she charged me as little as she could. So I paid $20, which in the United States is like unheard of. I don't know what it is like where you live, but in the United States to see a therapist for an hour is like $150 or something. She charged me 20. And then when she graduated, she was like, yeah, I want to keep you as a client, and like, I'll keep charging you $20. I was like, oh, that's super sweet. And so, yeah, so I worked with her for 6 years, and that saved me for sure. So I don't think there's any shame in like going to therapy or doing whatever you need to do to like help yourself out. Even if, I mean, you don't even have to be in an extreme circumstances like I was. Like if you just feel like you need someone to talk to, go to a therapist. Like I'm totally on board with that. I think, yeah, and because of that, you know, when I got out of prison, I got out with a lot of PTSD for a variety of reasons, both from Shaq and from prison. You know, prison was a place where like, you know, people were getting beat up. There were fights, there was beatings, there were stabbings, there was race riots and gang warfare, and like, you know, you are on a tightrope every single day for years, hoping that you don't get the living shit kicked out of you. So there's a lot of stress involved with that. And with Shaq, it was the same thing. Like, you know, you'd catch FBI agents or private security investigators like digging through your trash at 2 a.m, or you're worried that they're going to put a tracking device on your car. And for whatever reason, my room, because we rented a house, we'd rent homes, and then we'd have our office in the home, and so we lived in the home and you know, worked from the home. For whatever reason, like my window was always like above the driveway, so I just was like, every time you hear a car drive by, I'd jump out of bed and like look out the window to see what was going on, and it's exhausting. Like that takes a toll on you. So just recognizing like those things are real, and you shouldn't be ashamed to like try to get help with them. I will say, I just want to tie this back really quickly to what was said earlier. The one thing that really helped me through prison was getting letters. I can't stress enough how much those letters that I received from people helped. Like every letter was like a prison break for me. So like I'd get a letter or 10 or 20 a day, and I would take them up into my cell and I'd read each one, and each one allowed me to like escape from prison. Even if it was for 10 minutes, I would just sit there and read each letter nice and slow, and then go to the next one and the next one. If I got 10 letters, 10 minutes each, you know, I got a prison break for like an hour and a half. So if there are people whose stories are interesting to you or touch you, I would recommend writing them a letter, even if you don't hear anything back. I think it's really important. And if you do hear something back, then you know you have an opportunity to make friends with some amazing people. So yeah.
And on that, I'm just going to put it in the chat. So yeah, the 2 people I mentioned earlier, they shouldn't be in prison for long, but yeah, if anyone wants to email them, the details are there. So yeah, thanks for that. So I saw earlier, Gordy, you had your hand up, and now you put your question in the chat, but I was wondering if you wanted to say it anyway.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Jake. Well, one of the questions I have, I'm a firm believer in grassroots movement too. Usually, the first step is to get into you know, outreach, educational outreach. What are other ideas that we could look at to encourage more people to join and grow that way?
Yeah, I think educational outreach is a great way to get people involved in activism. I think educational outreach is like a really vital tactic. I think we confuse it a lot with strategy in the animal rights movement. But I think when we recognize it's a tactic, it's one puzzle piece in a broader puzzle, and start using them for our pressure campaigns, it's a great opportunity to get people involved in that educational outreach aspect, which is an easy lift for people, but also get them involved in pressure campaigning. You know, I think the thing with Shaq is like you watch the animal people and you're like, holy shit, that was so radical. Everyone's out like doing crazy stuff. But the reality is like the stuff you see in the movie is like the crazy stuff because it's a movie. But like that was a fraction of what was going on. I mean, we would get protests whenever someone would do something in the campaign, it would get emailed to us and we put it up on our webpage. And that meant like we got, yeah, the crazy, you know, people liberating animals and breaking into places and doing run-ins and disruptions. But, you know, we would get 400 or 500 write-ups a year. I mean, there was stuff going on 1, 2, 3 times a day, every day, somewhere in the United States. And a lot of it was like, we held protests. We stood outside for an hour or we wrote letters, or we gathered petition signatures. And so there's lots of ways for people to be involved in campaign work that isn't the crazy radical stuff you see in the animal people. And I think, again, educational outreach is a great way. Interestingly, another way that really I've found that brings a lot of people out is doing letter writing nights, where we would organize them once every other week, and we would write letters to prisoners. We'd provide the paper and the pens and the letters and the stamps, and then we get 20 people to show up every other week. We meet in a coffee shop or something, and then we'd all just hang out for an hour and write letters to prisoners. And we got to know people and build the community. And also, you can do that. You can do a mixture of like political prisoner writing, as well as like writing letters to companies or things like that. And then we started introducing guest speakers. So you'd be like, oh, we're gonna have someone come speak for 30 minutes, and then we'll write letters for 45 minutes or something. And so it was kind of like a political education aspect to it as well. So I think, like, again, it's doing things that are easy lifts, that are feel like there's no risk to them, and gets people interested, but also helps build community, right? Like, I think having fun doing your activism is just as important as like feeling like you're being effective. Like, if you have a nice community that you enjoy spending time with, you're gonna spend time with them, and the more you spend time with them, the more action and activism I think you'll do together. I could keep rambling about that, but I'll pause.
No, that's awesome. Yeah, building communities within the grassroots is it's totally important. And I think sort of doing fun activities, even going out for a vegan meal somewhere, it brings people in, and they want to be part of that, and they want to do more things together, which includes like you say, maybe pressure campaigns and stuff. Awesome, thanks. Cheers.
Yeah, totally. I just remember, when I first got involved, I started with this group called Northwest Animal Rights Network in Seattle, and called NAR, and it's still around. But yeah, we used to do our monthly meetings, and we go to Jerry's house, and there'd be like 15 of us sitting around every weekend. It was like Facebook, but pre-internet. So we just like bicker and argue and debate one another. And then we would pick a place and be like, all right, let's go do a protest here. And every weekend, every Saturday, we would do that. And it was great because we get 15, 20 people to show up. But when we started hosting them at vegan restaurants, we would get vegan restaurants to be like, hey, can you open an hour early? Or, at noon, we all come together, everyone gets 10% off or something, because we're bringing a business. And then, we have our meeting over a meal, and then we go out and do a protest. And we noticed that like we'd get up to 50 people showing up because we incorporated food, because we're all vegan. So like all we want to do is eat all day. So yeah, the idea of like having a meal and then being able to combine that with activism, I think is like a great way to build community and build up your group. Totally.
So I don't think there's any new questions in the chat.
I think Elliot put a star, so I'm wondering if that means you have a question, Elliot.
Yeah, sorry, I joined late, so I didn't know what the protocol is for asking a question. Kind of a weird one. Question. When you were charged, was there like any sense of relief because of kind of being like, okay, it's happened now, like I'm no longer like fearing it, because I know what's happening now to a certain extent.
Yeah. If you've seen the animal people, Lauren kind of answers that in the movie, where she's like, this is it. This is what you're charging us with, is like, you're running a web page. I mean, that was their entire box of evidence, like tens of thousands of printouts from our web page. It's like, yeah, it's already on the internet. Like, we know it's there. I don't think we've done anything wrong. So in a sense, that was kind of like a relief of like, oh, this could be the big one, but also it's like, that's it. That's all you got. So yeah. I think at that point, like I said earlier, maybe you weren't here, but like there's a lot of like machismo and chest pounding, like we can't be stopped type of feeling. And I think the initial response was like, this is just one more of this is number 25 of the cases brought against us that we're gonna beat. No big deal. But yeah, I think as time went on, that feeling shifted away to like, this might not be a good one. But yeah.
Cool, good question, Elliot. I'm gonna see if anyone else who hasn't asked a question yet has a question they would like to ask, feel free to put your hand up and then we can move back to the chat. Oh, there's a question from Tom there. Tom, do you want to read that out, or I'm happy to read it out as well? Cool, I will. Are there any current web pages or places we can find out about campaigns / actions to join in with?
That's a good question. I don't know that I have an answer for it.
Yeah, maybe that's something, because I don't know if that might be country specific. Does anyone here have any knowledge about this, apart from, of course, the Animal Rebellion website, where you can find out about our ongoing?
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of groups that have web pages that highlight their campaigns, but I'm not aware of a web page that kind of brings those things together. I think that would be a great idea.
Specifically animal rights or vegan, or just more general. Tom, do you want to clarify that? But yeah, like it sounds like maybe that's a gap in the movement.
Hi, can you hear me speaking?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, my mic didn't work. Hi, Jake. Yeah, just based on one of the previous questions, is educational outreach is obviously a way into activism that a lot of people take, but then once you've done that for a while, you've mentioned already that people get a little bit not tired, but they say, okay, now what? You know, what do I do now? and there doesn't seem to be a clear path in progression of activism and where to go from there, and how to get involved with more involved campaigns or more actions. You know, what's the next step to take? And I was interested to know if there was a sort of known place or known method of how to progress with activism after the initial stages.
In terms of like a web page and things, or generally speaking?
Yeah, generally speaking, a web page obviously is a very obvious network or hub or place where you can check it out as a central place. But yeah, sort of a place you can check in with, and then you can get a roadmap of where to go from there.
Yeah,
as a new yeah,
as a new person, yeah. Yeah. I think it's a great idea. I'm not aware of anything like that currently. I think that's why, in my experiences, like I think doing outreach as part of your pressure campaign is really important. Like for Shaq, again, something you don't see in the movie, but we lived in Pennsylvania, we lived in New Jersey over the course of 3 years, which is on the eastern portion of the United States, and it's a couple hours from New York City. So 3 or 4 times a week, some of us in Shaq would take the train up to New York City, and we would do stalls, you know, about the campaign, and we'd have our table, and we'd have, you know, information about the campaign. We'd have petition, we have a donation thing, donation tin, but we'd also have information on veganism. We'd have information on other campaigns like anti-fur or anti-circus stuff, and so to me, like that was educational outreach that also was part of a campaign, you know, and people could be like, see these dogs and cats, which is what we pushed like the dogs and cats in cages type of thing. And as people approached, they'd be like, they'd get an earful about that, but also about the other issues in veganism and things like that. Then we'd have a petition for them to sign to give them the impression, you know, like, oh, like there's something you can do immediately. And sometimes we would, you know, we did a lot of protests in the area, including in New York City. So we'd always have flyers, you know, if you're angry, like meet us tomorrow at, you know, this date, and this is what we're doing. And people would show up. Obviously, this is, you know, pre-social media, so I think it's a little bit different, done a little bit differently now. But you know, I think when you combine educational outreach, or you recognize educational outreach as a tactic as part of your broader strategy and your campaign work, then you can start doing some of that work naturally. You know, it'd be interesting. I always remember you know, the laboratory in New Jersey was about 2 or 3 hours south of New York City, I think. And I remember we did this demonstration at the lab at like 5 p.m. or something. And this guy came up late. He was like in this business suit, and he looked all kind of disheveled. And I was like, where did you, who are you? Like, where did you come from? And he's like, oh, I was working in the city today and I saw your table and saw the video footage you showed. And I was like, oh, I'm gonna come to your protest. And he like came 2 hours south from the city to like join in our protest. So, and granted, it's like one person and one example, but you know, it does work. Like you just, you know, and the guy obviously wasn't like vegetarian or vegan or anything. He was just like saw the cats and the dogs and got super pissed and showed up. And so I think that like, you know, combining those pieces does have an important element. I think, how do we do that now? I'm not really sure. I mean, maybe everyone carries smartphones, everyone's in social media. Maybe, you know, it's having QR codes that link to specific Facebook events. Be like, oh, you want to protest? Psh, here, like snap this QR code, it takes you to the Facebook event page. Or, you know, you want to protest fur, you want to come out to animal extinction or animal rebellion events, psh, scan this QR code. I don't know, maybe something like that. But there's got to be some sort of modern day equivalent of like handing out flyers for protests.
Great. So I think we spotted Alex. Did you have a hand up?
Yes. May I ask a quick question? So I had two, well, actually one real question about social media and whether, because it's so exciting to actually meet people, and you're talking about going for a meal. Wow, wouldn't that be amazing, everyone? Just go for a meal and actually see human people opposite us, you know, closer than 2 meters. It'd be amazing. But so I was going to ask, do you think that people have got a bit used to being able to click through things on social media? And so do you think that maybe that has to do with our feeling that people are less able to invest in what we're trying to do? What do you think?
Yeah, I think obviously we are in an extra unusual circumstance right now with COVID. But I do think that there are plus sides and downsides to social media. I think obviously like you're able to reach a broad group of people potentially through social media. You can network with people across the world. Like pre-internet, this obviously would not be happening. And so there's a lot of great opportunities. Knowledge is at your fingertips. I mean, when I got involved and I wanted to see undercover footage or I wanted to see protest footage from England, someone had to copy that VHS cassette tape. It got shipped across the Atlantic Ocean. I'd have to transfer it from NTSC or from PAL format to NTSC format for any of the old people out there. Remember that? And then, you know, you'd have to call your friends and be like, hey, I got the latest footage from the Consort Beagle Breeder national campaign where they smashed in the walls and grabbed the beagles. This is a true story. And then, you know, 7 of us would come over to Charles's house and we'd pop the tape into the VCR and be like, oh my God, that's amazing. Why can't we do that here in the United States? Like, that's how we did it. And it was exhausting. But at the time, you're like, this is totally amazing. Like, you don't know that there's some other like thing coming in 10 years where you just be like Consort Beagle Breeder footage and you watch 7 hours of it. So I like there's positives to it. The downsides, I think, is that like obviously we lose face-to-face organizing, and I think face-to-face organizing is really, really important. Not because for a variety of reasons, but partly because it builds up friendships and it builds up trust, and getting to know someone face-to-face. We talk, and I'm certainly guilty of it, but we talk a gang of shit online. You know, we are quick to throw insults and argue and debate and be mean to each other. And try doing that face to face, you know, like we should. I always think of this woman who was, you know, this is when I lived in the Bay Area at San Francisco. This woman just hated me. Every time I posted something about activism, she just talked a gang of shit. Like she just was like saying all these terrible things about me. And finally I messaged her. I was like, hey, you want to go out to lunch? And she was like, okay. And we went out to lunch, just the 2 of us, and she barely said a word. And like I wasn't rude, I wasn't mean. I just explained my case. She would ask me questions. I would ask her questions. And we had a nice lunch for an hour. And she understood where I was coming from. And I understood where she was coming from. And we never got into it again on the internet. I think there's something really valuable about face-to-face organizing and talking to one another and being friends with one another and respecting one another. You know, it's not to say that like all that other stuff, bad stuff doesn't happen. It certainly does. But I think, you know, when we can have those conversations, go out to meals, we're much better off. You know, when again, like not to be like, I'm old, but like, you know, when we did activism pre-internet days, you know, the United States is a huge country. We would have regional demonstrations where people would come from all over the West Coast. Someone in San Francisco will be like, hey, call up people in Seattle. How many people can you bring? Like, oh, we'll rent a van and we'll bring 10 people. Portland, how many people? Yeah, we'll rent 2 cars. And you can get 200, 300 people to show up and do a sit-in in front of a fur store by doing that face-to-face networking. And then you meet each other and you build community and trust. And so I think that stuff is super important. I think we've switched over to the idea that our success is based on likes and views and follows on social media, but it's all ones and zeros, right? I mean, it's just garbage. It doesn't mean anything. You know, people are always like, my video got 1 million views. Well, cool. On Facebook, a view is literally 3 seconds, which is a scroll. Who are these people watching these videos? Are they watching it? Because statistically, people only watch 8 to 10 seconds of a video on Facebook. 85% of it is with the sound off. So, you know, we post these like live feeds from our protests and this thing and that thing, and oh, got 1 million views. It's like, yeah, but people only watch the first 7 seconds of it without any audio. Like, we need to figure out ways to communicate with one another and get to one another and talk with one another beyond relying so heavily on social media clicks. That being said, I'm on YouTube and Instagram and Facebook and Clubhouse and Twitter. And so like, I'm part of the problem. I totally recognize it. But.
Awesome, thank you so much. So it's just coming up on 8:15 here, so 12:15 for you, I think.
I'm at 1 now. I forgot about the time change thing. I'm terrible with these time zones.
So if it's okay with you, we'll take 2 more questions and then wrap it.
I have a hard stop at 1:40, which is 8:40 for you. So yeah. Absolutely.
So I was going to take one from Fran in the chat, who said, which is your favorite campaign that you've ever been part of?
They've all been special and important to me. Shaq was amazing. I think, like, you know, we didn't win outright the thing we wanted to win, but we learned so much, we experienced so much, we grew so much. And there's still, you know, movements and organizations that still use those tactics and strategies quite successfully. I think it was a great way for, you know, I probably get more interest about the Shaq campaign from other movements than I do the animal rights movement, which is cool. Like, to me, that's a bridge building thing. I learned a lot about myself. I learned a lot about my skills and what I'm capable of and not capable of. And I learned that I don't like prison. So that's an important lesson to learn. You know, doing hunt sab stuff was really powerful. That was started with, you know, I talk a lot about hero worship and pedestals and things like that, if you watch me on YouTube at all, and I complain about it ad nauseum. But for me, like, I think it's okay to be excited about our friends and our community and the things that we do and celebrate those things, or even look at them as people to admire. And I've certainly done those things. But for me, when I got involved early on in my activism, I was like, yes to all those things, but also I want to meet those people. I want to, like, be friends with them. I want to learn from them, and I want to organize from them, so that we're equals, not put them on some pedestal. And so the hunt sab stuff for me was like, that's what I did. Like, I met, you know, the guy that was putting it together was a guy that I really admired. His name was Jonathan Paul. He's still active today. But he had been doing activism since the 80s, and he had done all sorts of amazing stuff. And I knew about him. I was like, I want to learn from this guy. So I learned a lot from Jonathan, and we're still friends today, 25 years later. And so, you know, that was really important to me, being able to learn from people I respected, and also understand the importance of and successes and downfalls of direct action. You know, earlier on, closing down or ending fur sales in certain clothing stores and boutiques taught me that, like, pressure campaigns work, you know, and that we had the power as a small grassroots organization to move things that we wanted to move. Like, was a really important lesson for me. Yeah, I could go on and on and on, but yeah, I'll stop there.
We love it. So, Michael, you have a question in the chat. Would you like to read that out, or would you like me to read it out? I can't see Michael.
Hello. Yeah, sorry, I have my camera off. Yeah, just how do you deal with family or partners who are anti-activism, and how do you handle awkward family conversations?
I'm pretty lucky in that regard, I think. I think really the only partner I've had that was, let me just think about this to make sure I'm right. But like the first partner that I had when I went vegan was like, nope, that's stupid. Like I remember her specifically saying, veganism's stupid. I mean, this was 1995 or whatever. So, you know, but she's like, this won't last. And then we broke up, and not because of that, but yeah, for other reasons. But after that, you know, I've dated people and been in relationships with people that weren't vegan, they weren't animal rights activists, but they're activists. And some of those relationships were some of the most important for me politically, and otherwise. But you know, learning about that was a really like critical piece in my life of like being like, oh, these people are amazing activists. They're winning way more than I'm winning. Why? What are they doing differently? And then being able to have those like really big conversations with partners, you know, that were activists but weren't vegan, and being able to be involved in their communities. Like what an opportunity. I know everyone's like, I would never date a non-vegan. I totally get it for sure. But interestingly, those were probably some of my most important political points in my life, was dating people that were activists but not vegan. My mom was anti-Vietnam War protester in the 60s. So that kind of helps. I think she raised me in like a good way, you know, to be like doing what's right over what's easy. I remember a couple of times, you know, being like in high school and being like, I'm fighting the man. And she's like, well, why are you fighting the man? Like, what are you fighting for? I don't really know. And she's like, well, maybe you should figure these things out. But, you know, she taught me these kind of lessons of like, to think about things and not just kind of go along with the crowd. She and I have gone back and forth on my activism, depending on what the topic was. You know, I've done like anti-fur stuff, anti-whaling stuff, and she is anti-fur and anti-whaling. So she was like, yay. And then she's a nurse, so she is pretty like in support of animal experimentation. So when she was like, we are doing what now against the laboratory? And then she was not happy about that. But interestingly, that I think politicized her more than any of the rest of my activism. You know, she you know, she got really pissed as we saw the movie. They recorded our phone conversations where she asked me if I was a terrorist, which we always laugh about now, still to this day. Yeah, so you know, that pissed her off, and it made her very like angry that the government was doing this, not just to like her son, but you know, to activists and people in general, like people that weren't even involved in activism. And so that I think politicized her. She became much more interested in political prisoner support. When I went to prison, she wrote me a bunch, she visited me, but she started writing other prisoners. When I got out of prison, she supported like prisoner support organizations with donations. And yeah, I think I'm pretty lucky in that regards. After we were found guilty, we weren't sent to prison right away. I was put on house arrest. But we had to do it at our parents' homes. So I was at my mom's house for 9 months. God bless her. But I mean, she was super supportive. You know, I couldn't leave the house, so she had to do all the grocery shopping. She would be like, "What's your favorite ice cream?" I'd be like, "It's this." And then she'd come up with like 8 pints of it, and I'm like, "Ugh, just like eating ice cream all day." Like, you know, she's a pretty special lady, and like the silver lining to that experience was that she and I got to spend 9 months together, and which might sound like a miserable experience for some people, but for me, it really like strengthened our relationship, and for that, I'm grateful. But I didn't really answer your question beyond just like, I got pretty lucky in that my family is, and partners that I've had have not been assholes to me about it, except for the first one.
Amazing. We'll take one more question from the chat, and then I have a final question that I'm going to sneak in. But yeah, we'll wrap up by 8:30, 30 past, whatever the hour is. So the final question in the chat is from, let's see who it's from. It is from, sorry, Gordy. So in the movie, it seemed that they invented a law, corporate economics terrorism. Is that right? Gordy, do you wanna?
Yeah, I can't remember what it was called, but the impression I got from watching the movie was they sort of couldn't find you guilty of anything, so they brought out this like, you know, a corporation economics terrorism type thing. Is that right, or did I just completely miss something?
No, that's correct. Kind of. I want to just add one more thing to Michael's question. Then I'll answer that question. I find a lot of value as I've gotten older. My relationships that I have with my family and my friends, regardless of where they're at on the political spectrum. Again, like I've said, I'm pretty lucky that everyone has, for generally speaking, like good politics. I think as I get older and you realize that like life is finite and life is complicated and it's tricky, but there are people hopefully in your life, whether they're friends or family or chosen family, that love you and you love them. I think putting aside politics as much as you can in order to foster those relationships is super important. And I talk about my mom because I love her and she's great and I wouldn't be who I am without her, but also like we don't share common, we don't share the same opinion on veganism, right? Like she's in support of veganism, but she's not going to be vegan. And I've accepted that as much as that might disappoint me. But I can also say like my mom has amazing qualities and she's a beautiful person and I owe her everything. And so I caution people to like put aside those important relationships because of veganism or because of animal rights. Now, of course, there's going to be situations where, maybe, you have family members that are like super right wing or fascist or whatever. And obviously like, there's everyone's different on what kind of politics you can put aside. And maybe that's veganism for you, I don't know. But for me, finding those common grounds in order to have relationships with people that I love and that they love me has been really important to me, particularly in the last few years. So I just wanted to add that on. So for Gordy's question, there is a law that was put into the books, I think in the late 80s, early 90s, called the Animal Enterprise Protection Act. That law basically was trying to stop people from driving from state to state. So in the United States, we have 50 states. Each state has their own laws. And then we have a federal system that supersedes state law. So the federal law, the Animal Enterprise Protection Act, was trying to get people to stop driving state to state and breaking into fur farms and laboratories and releasing animals and doing damage. So the law states that if you cross state lines to disrupt a business that uses animals and you do more than $10,000 worth of physical damage, you essentially can be tried as like a domestic terrorist. And so for us, they decided, as you see this in the movie, that they were just going to throw as many charges at us as they possibly could and see if one of them stuck. Unfortunately, they all stuck. But they charged us with things that were just not what the law says. So for instance, the Animal Enterprise Protection Act, they said that we violated it because we crossed state lines using the internet, because obviously you can access the internet from anywhere, and that we did more than $10,000 worth of economic damage to the corporation because we affected their share price and things like that. That's not how the law was written, but that's how the judge read it and allowed it and then instructed the jury to read it the same way. And that's partly how we were found guilty. They also charged us with conspiracy to commit interstate stalking, with the idea that because we did home demonstrations at people's homes, I think it was something like if you do a demonstration more than 3 times at someone's home, then you're considered like stalking them. It had never been, the law had never been used that way, and has not been used since. But yeah, so we got 4 counts. Well, Kevin, Lauren, and I got 4 counts of interstate stalking not because we did those home demonstrations, but because we reported and encouraged home demonstrations on our webpage. So in the United States, those are considered violent felonies. So Kevin, Lauren, and I have 4 violent felonies on our record because we encouraged people to do home demonstrations, which is absolutely bonkers to me. After our case, they used our conviction. They used our conviction to strengthen the law, and now it's called the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. They made it easier to prosecute you. They made it easier to get harsher sentences because at the time the maximum sentence was, I think, 2 years or 3 years, and now it's life. It's life imprisonment. If you like killed someone in the name of animal rights, you would automatically get a life sentence. And now it also includes secondary and tertiary targeting, meaning what we were doing in Shaq, they could charge us with the AETA for protesting against a bank. All that being said, that law has not been used since then. Well, they tried it once and they lost because it was ruled unconstitutional. But the only times it's been used successfully since our case in 2006 was prosecuting people that were driving cross country and breaking into fur farms, which is what the law was intended for. But yeah, so that law has not been used since successfully to prosecute activists.
Thank you so much. Yeah, just one more question before we go quite quickly. So yeah, it's been a hell of a week in the UK. It's a hell of a time in the world for protest, for social change. I just wanted to ask you, just before we go, what gives you hope?
I always ask that question and then I never have a good answer for it. I get hope in looking at communities that are resisting in big ways. So for me in the United States, I love the anti-pipeline fights. I think these fights are being led by Indigenous youth, which is amazing. There are amazing people in those spaces. They're mostly young people, and they're fighting back, and they're organizing pressure campaigns, and they're being smart with their strategies, smart with their tactics. They're kind of putting aside purity politics to work with unlikely allies from outside of their immediate communities. And for the most part, people are respecting that they are the leaders of this movement, these movements, I think, is the impression I get. And they're leading the charge and winning against these really important fossil fuel extraction programs. That gives me hope. That inspires me. I've been doing some talks with this organization called the Raven Corps in the United States, which is like a network of like young people. I think it's for 15 to 22-year-olds. And like, I go on there and do these talks with these 15-year-old kids, and they're just amazing. Like their political knowledge and their ideas and thoughts. And like, God, what was I doing at 15? I think I was like getting drunk and like throwing rocks at people's cars and stuff. I don't know, I was like acting like an idiot, eating animals and not giving a shit about anything. And these kids are like, they know it. And like, that gives me hope. Yeah, there's a handful of things that make me excited. I love grassroots activism, and I love radical activism because I love the idea of resistance. I love the idea of the underdog fighting back against the odds, and even if they don't win, putting up a good fight. And so whenever I see things like that, that really excites me and inspires me and gives me hope. The Black Lives Matter movement in the United States and beyond, incredible. Like what they have been able to do and achieve and organize in such a short period of time is unreal. People often say, "Oh, animal rights is the fastest growing social justice movement." I mean, you're getting hundreds of thousands of people to march in the streets for Black Lives Matter. Like, it's incredible. They're having sit downs with the president of the United States within 7 years of the inception of their organization. Yeah. I think that gives me hope. And my hope is that the animal rights movement can start to see some of those pieces and see how those strategies and those tactics work. And we figure out how to use them in the animal rights movement. And we figure out how we can build bridges between ourselves and those really amazing movements, Indigenous youth resistance and Black Lives Matter and things like that.
Amazing, thank you so much. And yeah, just thank you so much for giving all of us like so much of your time and for answering our questions. And yeah, I'll just throw to Angela to wrap up. And
yes, just gonna second a big thank you. I feel like we could just ask so many questions, and I'm probably going to sit in my bed tonight being like, I had the opportunity, but it's okay. Thank you for being so accessible and doing this with us. A lot of us are new to activism and a lot of us have had experiences as well, but it's great to just hear all of your different experiences and to share that around. So I think that's everything. So yeah, have an awesome day, and everyone else have an awesome evening or day wherever you're calling from in the world as well. Go to sleep, Mayo.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I'm really bad at answering messages. I try to do my best, but I work a full-time job and do all this at the same time. But I'm gonna drop in the chat all the different places that I'm at. If you want to follow along on social media or email me or whatever, feel free to bug me. I'm a big fan of like people bugging me. So if like you don't hear back from me, just keep pestering me. I know that that Harley and Angela can relate, but just keep bothering me and eventually I'll get back to you. I know it's not your responsibility to pester me to answer your questions, but unfortunately, like that's where I'm at in my life. But thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
We do have a recorded permission to pester you, so yeah, I'm gonna be
perfect.
Holding that one.
I'm so sorry. Sorry, I didn't interrupt. I'm sorry, I didn't realise that my microphone was on just then.
That's okay, no stress at all.
None of us realized.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. Great to see all your faces and names. And yeah, thanks so much, Jake. And yeah, let's keep these conversations going and keep this happening. And see you all soon. Oh, wait, sorry. Come along to our strategy update, 7th of April. It's in all the Telegram chats. So yeah, me and Ben will just keep plugging everything that you can come to learn more about how you can get involved in Animal Rebellion. So yeah, be there. See you all soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, guys. See ya.
Thanks, everyone. Oh.